I'm Steve Wolf, president of the Beyond Earth Institute, and welcome to this program titled Artemis Base Camp, a trailhead for sustainable lunar development. We have a really special program with some awesome speakers today. I'm really looking forward to getting into it. But first, just a few thoughts. Yesterday, as you know, was the 53rd anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. The United Nations actually has just this year designated July 20th as International Moon Day, and yesterday was the inaugural day for that, the celebration for that. That achievement, the moon landing, will be remembered as the most important event of the 20th century, I have no doubt. We are now again at the threshold of humans returning to the moon with the Artemis program. That's the topic of today. And as we look forward to that return to the moon, it's worth considering just how different the times are now from what they were back then. In 1969, there was no commercial space sector to speak of, with the nascent communication satellite industry, of course, is the single exception. To achieve that monumental goal of landing a man on the moon took the collective brain power and technical capabilities of the country. And of course, a blank check from government, right? There were no public-private partnerships, no COTS, no commercial crew, CLIPS, Viper, or other programs or anything like them. There were no space entrepreneurs, and certainly not much thought was given to creating a cislunar economy. But things are much different now. NASA is going to the moon with the commercial sector as a partner. NASA is moving away from cost-plus contracting and leaving the how of lunar exploration to the creativity of entrepreneurs who are willing to put their own money on the line. Until 1969, there was, unlike 1969, there is a burgeoning entrepreneurial and investment community ready to follow and even proceed in parallel with NASA's Artemis program. According to a Northern Sky research report, 77 commercial moon missions are proposed to launch over the next decade. And as the report says, the moon economy could be worth as much as $100 billion by then. This is the future that the Beyond Earth Institute is interested in helping to bring about through effective policy. A strong cislunar economy will be the underpinning that will enable the creation of communities beyond Earth. In today's program, we are interested in the days after the first Artemis footprints are made and looking ahead to the creation of the Artemis Base Camp and all things that are related to it. And we do that in discussion with the exceptional speakers that we have gathered today. And let me first, though, introduce to you introduce our moderator for today, Tyler Brender, who will be introducing the panelists. And so I will, there he is. So Tyler, just to introduce him, Tyler is the policy analyst for the Beyond Earth Institute and a federal contractor supporting FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation. His current work at Beyond Earth is focused on the potential long-term impact of NASA's Artemis program. So that's why he's perfect for today. He's a Marine Corps veteran and has a master's degree in international relations from the Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And I think, very interestingly, he also made a run for Congress in 2018 in his home state of Indiana. We're very pleased to have him as part of the Beyond Earth team. He's done a tremendous, tremendous job for us over the past 2 years. We could not have gotten as far as we have without him. So with that introduction, Tyler, I want to turn the program over to you.
All right, thanks a lot, Steve. Thanks for the introduction. And thanks for your help in getting this set up. I also want to thank our panelists and our guests for being here today as we continue our celebration of yesterday's inaugural International Moon Day. So our program today is going to include some remarks from our panelists. Then we'll have a moderated discussion, and we'll close things out with questions and answers with the audience. So if you have any questions as things are going on, feel free to type them up in the chat window, and we'll reach those. We'll get to those at the end. But let's start with introducing our esteemed panelists. First, we have Vishnu Reddy. Vishnu is an associate professor in the Lunar and Area Laboratory at the University of Space Objects, both natural and artificial, using a range of Earth and space-based assets. His work on natural moving objects, including a near-Earth object that is likely a chunk of our moon, is directed towards their characterization for impact hazard assessment and mitigation, and also for resource utilization. To this effort, Vishnu uses the NASA Infrared Telescope Facility on Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Dr. Reddy uses the same techniques used to characterize asteroids to study the behavior of artificial objects, to identify their nature, intent, and origin. To further this work, he's setting up a space material characterization lab to observe the reflectance properties of natural and artificial space materials in space-like conditions. And I can't believe I didn't mess up saying any of that. Next, we have Peter Gerritsen. Peter is a senior fellow in defense studies with the American Foreign Policy Council, the co-director of its Space Policy Initiative, and the host of the Space Strategy podcast. He was previously the director of Air University's Space Horizons Task Force, an Air Force think tank for space, and was a founder and deputy director of the U.S. Space Force's Schreiber Scholar Strategy Seminar, America's premier military space strategy program. Peter is also the author of Scramble for the Skies, the great power competition to control the resources of outer space, which in my opinion is an excellent book that he co-wrote with Namrata Goswami. And to introduce our keynote panelist, which our headline act, as I like to say, as a former musician, I'm going to turn to Courtney Stad, who is a tremendous asset to Beyond Earth as our vice president. With a career that has spanned a mix of senior government leadership and corporate executive jobs, Courtney's been in the space game for nearly 40 years, and his work has focused primarily on removing policy and regulatory barriers to the emergence of a competitive, US-led commercial space marketplace. Courtney, on to you.
Thank you very much, Tyler. I've known and worked with NASA leadership for well over 4 decades at this point. And I can say that Dr. Bavia Law is one of the most effective inside players that I have witnessed, including a reputation for speaking truth to power. Now, having said that, I don't know what Dr. Law is going to say during her remarks, but I do know that rule number 1 in DC is never get ahead of your boss. So within those constraints, look forward to hearing what you have to say. We are very grateful for you, Bavia, carving out time from an impossibly busy schedule to participate in this topic, because obviously Artemis is a very timely and a program with a lot of moving parts. Bavia is Associate Administrator for Technology, Policy, and Strategy with a direct reporting to the Office of the Administrator, including almost constant interaction with Pam Melroy, the Deputy Administrator. In this position, she has a broad portfolio providing guidance to the NASA leadership on internal, external policy issues, strategic planning, technology investments. And she's also, as I joke with her in her copious free time, the acting chief technologist. She was also on the NASA transition team before she became the transition chief of staff and before taking over her current responsibilities. I've had the honor of knowing Bavia for some years now, starting with her work at the DC-based Institute for Defense Analyses, where her clients included the White House and federal agencies such as NASA and DoD. And before that, she worked for a very prominent Cambridge-based institute as well. For those of us who ply the waters, sometimes perilous waters in the space policy field, one of the many things we admire about her work, be it commercial satellites, space nuclear power, on-orbit servicing, assembly, and manufacturing, human exploration, space science, she covers a gamut, is Bavia's focus on the hard facts, realistic challenges that need to be met in such a demanding technical domain as space. Now, if you want a dose of inferiority complex, just take a look at Bavia's academic background. Bachelor's and master's degrees in nuclear engineering from MIT, a second master's from MIT's technology policy program, and oh, by the way, a PhD in public policy and public administration from GW University. It has published more than 50 papers in peer-reviewed journals and conference proceedings, just stunning. So once again, we are so honored to have you, Dr. Lal, and it is now my distinct honor to turn the microphone over to you.
My goodness, Courtney, you are too kind. Everything I do, it's because I learn from folks like yourselves. So for inviting me, I'm just so excited to be here. In fact, I'm at a hotel in Pittsburgh and I'm looking out at the University of Pittsburgh. I have spent the day yesterday visiting Carnegie Mellon University, and today I was at Astrobotic, and it's been, sort of an all moon all the time, kind of a day and a half, and it is just so exciting. I mean, we are just such an amazing point in time. Just yesterday, we announced the launch of Artemis 1, hopefully followed soon with Artemis 2, and then we land on the moon. It's just a heady time. So we are here to talk a little bit about the Artemis Base Camp concept. And again, I will not get ahead of my boss. So just wanted to kind of start by saying that the Artemis Base Camp concept represents the key capabilities we will need to do long-term science investigations and technology demonstrations on the moon. What is a base camp? It's something that is, being deliberated, but at the very least, it includes an unpressurized rover, a pressurized rover, surface habitat, fission surface power. I'm very excited about that. That's my background, as Courtney just mentioned, and a host of lander and logistics to maintain supplies across multiple Artemis missions over many years. As you know, just from my experience the last day and a half, we have incredible interest from US industry and international partners who are eager to contribute to the Artemis Base Camp. And honestly, there's plenty of opportunities to contribute, whether it be it power systems and management, robotics, communication and navigation, sampling and curation, and so many more areas. I do want to note that Artemis is much more than just a base camp. Just having visited Astrobotic today, we have the CLIPS program, right? And it stands for Commercial Lunar Payload Services Initiative. We have more than a dozen US companies eligible to bid on small payload deliveries to the moon with multiple task orders. Ahead of humans on the lunar surface. In lunar orbit, we are also developing the Gateway, which is a small spaceship that will operate as a scientific outpost with major elements contributed by NASA, our partners, European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, JAXA, the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agencies, and hopefully more to come. The Gateway will also serve as a staging point for human missions to the lunar surface. Its autonomous operation and interoperability standards will make it possible for even more contributors to send science instruments and investigations over the Gateway's lifetime, taking advantage of its vantage point in deep space. We are developing capabilities to deliver crew and cargo to the lunar surface. As you all may know, SpaceX is on contract to deliver 2 crew members to the lunar South Pole on Artemis 3. And that mission will include the first woman to step foot on the moon. And as I like today, the second woman, and then the third woman, and the fourth woman. So we are going to the moon like never before. And the lessons we learned through Artemis will make us stronger as we embark on the first human mission to Mars. I have so much more to say, Tyler, but let me end here and let my co-panelists speak. And I really look forward to the questions you might have for us.
Thank you very much, Bavia, for introducing the Artemis program. We'll turn to you now, Peter.
All right. So, the topic of the day is Artemis Base Camp, a trailhead for sustainable lunar development. And so, first of all, I just want to start, with an alignment that I, truly believe that the establishment of a scalable and growing lunar industrial facility at the South Pole is among the most important investments our nation can make for its long-term prosperity and security, and that it is absolutely necessary that NASA succeed in what I would call a right-focused Artemis Base Camp, and sustaining purpose across administrations is absolutely critical. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to deliver some tough love to how I think this is stacking up. So, in short, I think, my answer is no, that I don't think that the architecture as currently designed meets policy and sustainable objectives. The program sacrifices important long-term economic objectives for less important short-term symbolic objectives. The plans at present for the base camp are vague and anemic, and in my view, too vague and anemic to really catalyze what was asked for in the national guidance. The launch cadence is too low to meet political objectives. The early focus and distraction of the base camp likely means, of the gateway means that base camp, may be over 15 years old, which could be effectively never politically. SLS at $4.1 billion a launch is truly not sustainable. And it's unclear whether or not, and I know this is not true of Bavia or her boss, but having just sat through a lunar day myself, I'm not convinced that NASA is serious about the strategic competition with China or serious about meeting political timelines, budgets, or constraints. And there are these elements that are averse to getting stuck on a planetary surface, of playing a central role in economic development, and some even see space development and settlement as fringe ideas. So I worry that the lack of cost and schedule discipline, the disconnect from larger political objectives, and in particular, the advocacy community, puts the program at great risk. So what was NASA asked to design for? Well, if you look at the national space policy, the highest level goal is to promote and incentivize private industry and facilitate the creation of new global and domestic markets for the United States. And additional important ones are to extend human economic activity into deep space by establishing a permanent presence on the moon, which would not be 30 days or a few days. That would be like continuous occupation by human beings, to increase the quality of life for all humanity, including economic resource discovery and use. Now, the vision was exceptionally clear. It said that our national vision, is for sustainable human and robotic presence across the solar system, where there is an expanding sphere of commercial, non-governmental activities with increasing numbers of Americans living and working in space, and that begins with a campaign to utilize Earth's orbital environment and the surface and resources of the moon and cislunar space to develop those capabilities. And that, consistent with the SPD-1, we were supposed to land Americans on the moon by 2024, which we're going to miss, to establish a sustainable human presence by 2028, which we're going to miss. And that, that NASA needed to focus on resource utilization. And then, the National Space Policy, tasked NASA with enabling human expansion across the solar system and to lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization, including with commercial partners. And then it was very clear, the urgency that, NASA was to accomplish this by any means necessary, that it needed to consider all potential platforms, and that if commercial rockets were the only way to get astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets it would be. And of course, that has not turned out to be the case. So in essence, what NASA was asked to design is to put in place the fundamental building blocks of a cislunar economy and to use the Artemis Base Camp to bring that about in as fast as possible to achieve a position of security versus our competitors. So, what I'd like to say is that, wow, this is so clever. I'd never thought of it. This plan is way better than our competitors. We can relax. They've got it. Their head is fully in the game. They've got the eye of the tiger, going after the competition, that they're spending the tax dollars well. But, what are we actually getting at the end of this? Not by 2028, but by 2032 or 2034, this is the best image I can find of the Lunar Base Camp. And that's pretty anemic. An unpressurized rover, a pressurized rover, a tiny ISRU plant, a tiny surface hab. I don't think that was what was in mind when the administration provided this guidance. And so, I'm sort of with the folks that asked at Ars Technica over the leaked NASA report, has anybody at NASA read the policy? So let's look at the actual architecture. So of course, the big the big dollar item is the Space Launch System, a fully, or I should say, a fully expendable rocket, single-use rocket, the Orion capsule, the Gateway station to be around the moon, and of course, the human landing system, which will actually bring folks to the surface. Of these, the one that gets, the star is HLS. If HLS succeeds, it offers the possibility to obviate basically all of these other pieces. The surface architecture also consists of this spacesuit, of some kind of a hab, some kind of an unpressurized and a pressurized, rover, and what appears to be the plan. So, to me, there are a number of plans of uncrewed, and then finally crewed to get just 2 folks down on the lunar surface, which essentially looks like a recreation of Apollo on about the same timeline that it took before. And then, of course, there's this to Mars, from which you can get, some idea of what appears to be planned for the lunar surface. Now, let's talk about what's right with the plan, because there are elements of this that are just absolutely terrific. So the first thing is a vehicle that can land on any rocky surface, that can refuel in orbit, that can land 100 metric tons, absolutely game-changing for everywhere. Now, that is a railroad. And hopefully NASA will also get the money necessary to have an additional secondary lander, because that would be very enabling to where we need to go. Then CLIPS, wow. Look at this, look below at the launch cadence for CLIPS. Absolutely amazing. Now CLIPS, I think, is really the model for everything that Artemis should be. All right, and then the other thing that NASA really has done right is the Artemis Accords. So if there's one thing that I think is going to lock in and make this a sustainable program, it's the fact that we have put our political capital on the line and have additional partners that are part of this program. So in the same way that it's very hard to kill the F-35, even though it's over budget and doesn't fit the strategic need, it may be very hard to kill Artemis. And I hope that's the case, because as I said, it is vitally important that we continue forward with this. Also, the Artemis Accords are phenomenal for shaping the international norm space. And I'm a huge fan of lunar fission power, though again, I think it's anemic. I think to do really important type of ISRU, NASA needs to be targeting megawatts and above. I'm also a fan of the lunar surface initiatives, which really seem to be right focused on the sort of things that are going to enable manufacturing. But we don't seem to have the kind of dedicated funding lines to in situ resource utilization and in-space manufacturing that are really going to be needed. So let's talk about what's wrong with the plan. Well, from the leaked NASA report, you can see that the likelihood of further delays of going, in some cases, 2 years without a flight, and then the extreme cost. So, if you total those missions up, 9 to 11 missions between 2022 and 2034 at $4 billion a launch is like $36 to $45 billion. Now, if you could do the same thing, and what's amazing is that nowhere on this cadence is there even a consideration of using Starship Direct. But Starship Direct, with 11, refuelings, would be like 11 missions would be 1.1 billion, which would leave forward a lot of additional money for ISRU and actual content on the moon. And, for the cost of one SLS, we could be having 4 sorties per year for 10 years with plenty of money left over for ISRU. And then when you look at this, what's very disappointing to those of us hoping to see lunar industrialization is how much time is taken up by the Gateway early on, and how late in the game, 2032 or later, comes the habitat. So, when you look at that, 4.1 billion versus 10 million launch, and of course you'd need about 10 launches in order to make up for it, but still, 100 million is a rounding error compared to, 4.1 billion. So, as a taxpayer, the potential for waste here concerns me. And so, this is notice that this does not look anything like, it looks much more like Apollo on the left than any of the grand visions and ideas that we've been thinking about. It looks kind of close to this, only in point of fact, this is a much clearer vision from China and Russia about what their lunar base camp is going to look at. And much more prominently, I think, features fission surface power. And it certainly is not this vision of exploiting Earth-Moon space for industrial development to enable construction of space-based solar power satellites, which is what the leader of the Chinese Strategic Support Force, General Zhang Yulin, had said. So, it's not clear that this truly responds to the need expressed by USCC, or the need to look at the viability of space-based precious minerals, space solar power as asked for by the Congress. So how can it be fixed? Well, there are people at NASA that I think really are thinking correctly. I'm a fan of this idea of a lunar COTS program. I'm a fan of the Lunar Surface Initiative. I think these, we could cut some of the expendable portions and really put our money here. And then, when we talk about sustainability, right, it's that you can keep going. It's affordable and it's considered worth doing by the electorate. And for sustainable growth, it keeps on growing, meaning more activity every year, exponential growth, compound interest. And it will, and sustainable development means that it also will not stall due to a lack of necessary inputs or environmental impact. And I contrast that with rent, right? We're not talking about just sustaining a budget and workforce. We're talking about sustaining ever increased economic activity on the moon. So what do you need to do? We need to start with the right vision, beginning with the end of mind, which is the national guidance for economic industrial development of the moon, which is not science. It's not testing camping gear for Mars, and it's not virtue signaling. It is instead industrialization at scale to create a Pearl Harbor in space with a focus on in situ resource utilization and in-space manufacturing. And specifically, I think it should be for space solar power. Now, what could it be? Well, we need to ensure early Starship success. I think retiring SLS to have better options sooner rather than later will enable this to be a success. I think an even higher cadence for Eclipse, including Starship, dedicated funding lines for ISRU and OSAM, not just at NASA, but in DOE and DOD. We need to set production targets for a lunar industrial facility at the Artemis Base Camp. And we need a lunar COTS program for housekeeping with a kind of land grants or housekeeping grants for early entrants. Now, I think the powerful goal is equivalent to what the PRC has said. Let's use lunar resources to build a prototype solar power satellite in geostationary orbit. That would require some 400 metric tons to be processed and launched. It creates an initial market for metals, glass, ceramics, semiconductors, propellant. It creates another market for prospecting, regolith mining, ice mining, power systems, in-space transportation systems. And it creates an industrial base that can process large amounts of lunar and raw material, refine large amounts of lunar raw materials into metals, glasses, ceramics, build structural components, functional materials, commodities, and transport hundreds to thousands of metric tons anywhere in cislunar. And what would be next? Well, strategic minerals, unique products, large spacecraft. It creates COTS-like industrial partners for transportation, port operations, mining, processing, manufacture, assembly, space stations and habitats, and private or sovereign R&D. And just to finish up here, it also creates opportunities for the United States to have an in-space strategic reserve, a commodities futures exchange, with secure government, meaning NASA, purchasing of these services. It's secure revenue to enable debt financing. A prototype enables production at scale that could go to a $10 trillion annual energy market. And once the capacity is there, they will look for other folks to service. And lastly, an industrial base like that enables really ambitious things like planetary defense, interstellar probe, asteroid mining, and free-flying human settlement. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Peter, for your candor And also thank you for offering solutions and not just criticisms. We oftentimes see people kind of bashing NASA and not offering anything as an alternative. So thank you for offering solutions to what the problems are. Next, we're going to turn to Vishnu Reddy for more talk on sustainability and how being aware of what's in the cislunar environment is important for safety, security, and sustainability. Vishnu, over to you.
All right, let's see if I can share. So I'm going to talk something completely benign compared to what Peter just presented. Okay, so again, my name is Vishnu Reddy. I'm at the Lunar Planetary Lab. My background is basically in space surveillance and planetary defense. So this is, I consider Moon as a giant near-Earth asteroid. So, and we'll go from there. I'm going to focus on three themes, primarily looking at safety, security, and sustainability, and kind of walk through. Kind of these are my thoughts about what's going on. First is in terms of cislunar space domain awareness, focused on safety, security, looking at things beyond the moon that some of our adversaries look at as lunar outposts, and then sustainability primarily focused on ISRU. Let's see. Go to the next slide. So if you look at the Artemis Accords and how they map into these three themes, the first thing is safety. We want to ensure the safety of our astronauts in lunar orbit, both on the gateway and on the surface with this proposed base camp. And looking at conjunctions between robotic spacecraft and debris. We're currently doing conjunction analysis for Artemis 1 in cislunar space. And these relate to kind of registration of space objects. We want to know where things are. Looking at orbital debris and spacecraft disposal beyond geo. Security, we want to avoid strategic surprises from our adversaries who have, ambitious plans like Peter mentioned, and kind of aggressive timelines to dominate the cislunar space. And, relating to the Artemis Accords, we want to ensure peaceful purposes of cislunar space, deconfliction of activities. We don't want people to run into each other. And also provide a sense of transparency. This relates again to having a domain awareness and how that relates to security as well. And the last one is sustainability, ensuring that lunar ISRU, the resources we have are not kind of depleted. I know the concern right now is whether we're going to stay there long or not, but if we end up staying, how do we, access these resources in a sustainable way? And kind of relates to the space resources aspect of Artemis Accords. So kind of let's walk through each of these three themes, and I'll give some examples of it. So we all know the situation around the Earth. We currently track more than 22,000 pieces of mostly space junk, kind of larger than the size of a grapefruit, and about another 300 to 600,000 larger than the size of a golf ball. Most of them traveling at very high velocities. And you can kind of see this graphic showing things in low Earth orbit. And if you get a closer look, you kind of see where things are right now as it stands around the Earth. About 90% of everything we currently track in space is junk, unfortunately. And we want to try and avoid that when we get to cislunar space. And we've seen, activities like this in movies, like, see this is some gravity. One of the things we want to really avoid is the Kessler effect, which basically talks about the density of objects in low Earth orbit, which is so high that every collision that's generating debris would increase the probability of further collisions. And so this kind of would render space activity unfeasible for several generations. Fortunately for us on the Earth, we have the atmosphere, things in low Earth orbit come down with the solar cycle. We don't have that option in low lunar orbit if we have to have a Kessler effect situation in low lunar orbit. So we want to avoid that. So how do we go about doing it? Before we do that, we want to understand what is the cislunar space domain. We're kind of looking at, this graph here where Earth is in the middle. This is roughly to scale, showed the location of geo in that yellow circle. And then 5 times geo is also shown, and then, 10 times geo. So to give you an idea, one lunar distance is about 9 times the, geostationary distance, which is, about 42,000 kilometers. And then if you extend it out to the Lagrange points, the Earth Moon Lagrange point, we're talking about 12 times geostationary distance. So the volume of cislunar space to surveil and keep track of, I think we had the discussion about possibly 70 payloads going to the moon over the next decade. the volume is pretty huge. It's about 1,700 times the volume of what you have in geo. So it's a big area to keep track of, and we want to make sure that things were, we know where things are, and nobody's interacting with each other inadvertently. So more recently, early this year, we detected an object that had made a close flyby of the moon, and eventually led to its impact on the moon in early March. So this was a rocket body that we've been keeping track of with the Planetary Defense Telescope. So it's no longer a thing that we don't know where, if it's lunar space domain awareness is something, an academic exercise. We have real objects that are actually impacting the moon, and we want to keep track of them. So here's an image of a new crater that's been formed by the impact of this rocket body. These are images from LROC showing the impact crater that was created on March 4th, thanks to this rocket booster. And it's hard to attribute things to a certain nation or a certain actor when you don't know where things are. So we're still trying to figure out whether this rocket body belongs to SpaceX or China. And we have some ideas about it, but again, like I said, attributing responsibility or taking ownership of an object in cislunar space is really challenging, because we haven't been keeping track of things since their launch. The next topic I want to focus on is, kind of the security aspect of it, and this focuses on lunar outposts beyond the moon. We know the Earth, we know the moon, but there are things that are, other than that, like near-Earth objects that are related to the moon that we need to keep an eye on. So we have an object called 2016 HO3. This was discovered in 2016. It's been renamed Kamau-Leva, which is Cosmic Wanderer in Hawaiian. It has a very Earth-like orbit, 366 days, and the closest it comes is, 13 lunar distances. It's one of the most stable quasi-satellite. In other words, we regularly get satellites and mini-moons, quasi-satellite mini-moons capture on the Earth, but they last only from a few days to a few months to a few years, then they depart the Earth-Moon system. Whereas in this case, this object is going to stick around for about 300 years. And it's in a very peculiar orbit. Here's a short animation that shows the orbit. It goes around the sun at the same time it goes around the Earth. So you can see it also dance around the Earth. So the Earth kind of tugs it, back and forth. So one of the things we found out about this when we went and studied this object is that its composition is very similar to that of the moon. In fact, the squiggly line, the purple one, is a sample of lunar regolith brought back by Apollo 17, and it matches the spectrum of this object. These are these dots over there. And it's very different from a typical asteroid, such as the Itokawa here, that's shown in blue line. So so we need to keep track of this in the sense that, we have stable locations in the Earth-Moon system where our adversaries are interested in going to. So for example, the Chinese are planning a sample return mission with Russian participation in 2025-26 timeline to go land a spacecraft on this object. It's a relatively small object. It's 50 meters across. So it's not big real estate compared to the moon. But the fact that we have, objects in the Earth-Moon system that are stable to hundreds of years means that, they could potentially serve as outposts beyond the moon for our adversaries. And the last thing I want to talk about is sustainable ISRU. We know for a fact that traditional ISRU focus on water primarily rather than precious metal located in lunar cold traps. These are kind of PSRs, of permanently shadowed regions, where the temperature is about 300 Kelvin or negative 230 degrees Celsius. And there's a substantial amount of these, there are about between 300 to 500 craters that have some type of permanently shadowed regions, roughly approximating to about 6% of the surface of the moon. It kind of makes sense to tap into these PSRs, given that, we believe that there's water in a form we can understand, kind of water ice or frost, and we can process, where we can extract this, this water using some type of heat. And the hydrogen that we extract can be used for storing energy in terms of hydrogen fuel cells or for propulsion, along with oxygen as the oxidizer. But water trapped in PSRs is a finite resource on the moon, just like oil on the Earth. And we really don't know exactly how much water is there, despite the fact that water was discovered early on by Clementine, almost 30 years ago. We haven't spent the resources to kind of, map and understand. It's still a scientific academic exercise rather than a commercial exercise. But we also need to look at minerals on the moon, just beyond the permanently shadowed region. Moon contains vast quantities of oxygen. So about, the minerals that are on the moon, especially oxides, about 40% of it is oxygen. And those can be liberated and used as oxidizer, which, primarily is a bigger chunk than fuel when you're trying to use for propulsion. And reducing these minerals, such as like ilmenite. So, here's a beautiful image from LROC, operated by Arizona State University, where you can see these dark patches. These are titanium-rich basalts on the moon, where you can reduce these titanium-rich basalts, which primarily contains a mineral called ilmenite, and try and extract water from it. And that could be used for producing, oxidizer, and then you can also recover the hydrogen you used to reduce it in the first place. So the challenges, if I close out, there are significant technological challenges that remain before we can tap lunar resources for a sustainable presence. I think I kind of agree with Peter on his concerns regarding ISRU. The source of heat, for example, for melting the ice in these permanently shadowed craters, reducing minerals, purification, liquefying hydrogen, oxygen. How do you transport these, materials to location where we need to use, and doing that while maintaining the temperature? You liquefy hydrogen, at I think 30 Kelvin. If you're trying to pull it out of a permanently shadowed region and transport it to a location where you're going to launch it, you need to be able to sustainably do it. So there's a lot of technical challenges. I think, it's good to get to the moon on a short notice, but if you want to stay there, we need to have a lot more investment in the scientific aspect of it. Whether it's enabled by government or commercial entities is something to be desired on. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Vishnu. As you said, it is important to think about what we do when we get there. How do we use those resources, along with how do we get there in the first place? So I'll wait for our panelists to come back on camera, and then we'll start our moderated discussion. So my first question is, this is for all three panelists. It's a two-part question. Why, and this has been kind of touched on, but I'd like to go in more detail on this point. Why is the Artemis program so important? And to take that one step further, why is the human element of Artemis so important? And Bobby, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so you are correct, Tyler, in that I think we all touched on pieces of that. I mean, as we've just been talking, Artemis represents both the human and robotic exploration of the moon, and ties together a coalition of like-minded nations who want to peacefully explore the moon for the benefit of all of humanity. So we don't have any one particular sort of focus, right? It isn't just industrial development or science, it's sort of all of the above, right? So that's kind of one piece of it. And another piece of why it's important, it is very important for the United States. And I think, Peter pointed to that. It's important in the United States to maintain leadership in space so that we can continue to advance technologies needed for, deep space research, and ensure that new discoveries are made and available to all. And again, it kind of comes down to the basic, why do we explore? It's sort of the same as, why, because it's there, kind of, right? Why do we explore mountains or oceans here on Earth? It's a promise of new discoveries. These discoveries are for knowledge, they are for economic benefit. And so there's sort of no one, silver bullet, which is, I think, one of the chat questions we're kind of talking about, the silver bullet. I mean, I think we all try to look for one, but it's a lot of all of the above, right? Artemis program is a huge component of jobs in the United States. It's a huge component of our international leadership, our coalitions in space. So it's kind of all of that. And to your one further point, why is the human element? I mean, we could continue to use robotic for extraterrestrial exploration, but robots are so far no match for human dexterity, for problem solving, decision-making, and speed. Astronauts, humans, have the potential to reveal some of the biggest secrets about our solar system. For example, in the case of Artemis, formation of the Earth-Moon system. And again, just to, pull back to the Artemis Base Camp, it's a concept that in many ways builds on our experiences here on Earth. And there's sort of many analogies. Some have made the analogy of the McMurdo station. Some have made analogies of an industrial park, which includes private sector, industry, government, citizens. So it's kind of brings together all of the above. And of course, it's an extreme environment which we have the responsibility to keep all of our explorers safe and productive. And so kind of those, I hope, hit the key points, and I look forward to hearing what the other panelists say.
Thank you, Bavia. We'll go to you next, Peter.
All right, so I do think Artemis is vitally important. I think it's principally important, because this is, in my view, the moon is the jewel of the solar system. It enables everything further ambitious we would want to do. And the economic development of the moon will determine whether or not the future of human civilization is free. It will determine whether or not the United States and our free nation allies and partners are going to be wealthy enough in the future to be able to sustain and protect the kind of lifestyle that democracies have. And if we fail to adequately scope our space program and allow autocracies to, essentially do what some of the European powers did in bridging to the new world and having a tremendously deep war purse, we sacrifice our long-term freedom. The second is even broader than free societies. It's survival and flourishing of the entire ecosystem and clade of life. And that gets to your second question of why are humans so fundamentally important? Well, because it's a final end, right? So fundamentally, this is not really about exploration. Exploration is a precursor to migration and settlement. So, ultimately, NASA's mission is to enable space settlement. We want a multiplanetary, trillion human being civilization spread across the inner solar system. That can only be enabled by space industrial capabilities. It can only be enabled by using this amazing logistics hub, this trampoline to the stars offered by the moon. But it's important that we not get wrapped around science and exploration, because those are not final ends. Those are precursor ends that allow us to migrate, to move out, to survive long-term, and of course, to flourish as individuals and a species.
So Tyler, the question was why people and not robots, right?
Yes, essentially that's the question. And why on the moon?
I think I'll take it a little step further and saying, we should have the right people, just like we have purpose-built robots, not sending Roombas to the moon, right? And if you look at the Apollo program, of the 12 persons that walked on the moon, the one that matters the most to me, as a scientist and a geologist is Jack Schmidt, right? So you have to send people not just for the sake of sending people, but also send people for the purpose they're going to accomplish. And I understand Peter's point here, where he talks about the purpose of NASA is to enable human settlements across the solar system, which is true. But to get to that point, we have to send the right people first. You don't send people to live in any location randomly, right? You send people who would make that place livable before regular people can go. So similar to that, we need scientists, we need astronauts, we need engineers to go and make sure that the location we're going to go, is habitable. And beyond that, I think, you have to look at, no matter how good robots get, you can't replace a human being. The decision-making power, the human brain is extremely complex, and it can think on its feet, rather than trying to have, as much as we have autonomous robots now, that do even rovers on Mars do some part of the navigation autonomously without having to be driven from the Earth. The human in the loop, it makes it a huge difference. So similar to that, I think, as a scientist, you look at a rock with your eyes, you can make a decision, 100 times faster than any robot or rover can do. So having people for the purpose they would serve on the moon or anywhere else in the solar system is a huge plus compared to just doing it robotically.
Could I jump in and say something, Tyler?
Sure,
as much as I would love to say that the purpose of NASA is to settle space, we are driven by the laws of our country, and the Space Act is very clear as to the purpose of NASA, and settlement is not on there. We may want that to be on there. That's a totally different discussion. But I think we are, as long as we have the system of government we have, where we have, Congress that guides what we do and how we do it, we kind of have to abide by those laws, and settlement is not the purpose of NASA. I mean, again, I have my NASA hat on. I could take the NASA hat off and put on my personal hat and say it should be, but it isn't. I just wanted to clarify that.
Oh, yeah,
and
no,
neither is industrialization, right? I mean, if you look at our legislation, it talks about science, exploration, collaboration, peaceful applications. And again, I'm kind of speaking from memory, developing commercial activities, but industrialization, again, we may want it to be, and it behooves us. We are a democracy, right? As a democracy, we can change our system. And an example of that would be planetary defense, which actually is obviously superbly important. Planetary defense wasn't on the NASA founding legislation, but over time, as a result of efforts by citizens like ourselves, it went into legislation, and now NASA funds planetary defense, and we see that as a core mission. So I think we have some work to do before we start to expand what NASA does.
No, and that's a fair point. NASA's constrained somewhat by what the law says NASA is supposed to do. And that ties into my next question. This is for you, Bavia. So Peter mentioned that the national space policy states that the United States will lead the return of humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization. And also in the 2020 NASA Authorization Act, speaking of Congress calls on NASA to collaborate with commercial and international partners to establish sustainable lunar exploration by 2028. Now, by current plans, it doesn't look like NASA will meet that timeline that Congress has asked for. So what does NASA need to meet Congress's goal of establishing sustainable lunar exploration by 2028?
So yeah, you're absolutely correct. The National Space Policy does say that the United States will lead and return humans to the moon for long-term exploration and utilization. Check, we are working on that. NASA 2017 NASA Transition Authorization Act, which is the last time there was a authorization, not in 2020, calls on NASA to collaborate with commercial and international partners to establish sustainable lunar exploration by 2028. Check, we are working on it. It is difficult in the space sector to assign specific dates. So much depends on funding levels. Also sustainable lunar exploration is a term that's not clearly defined. It means different things to different people, as we are learning in this discussion. We have a strong architecture strategy. We are working on it. We actually just developed 50 objectives on how we will achieve these goals. We vetted these objectives by industry in the United States. We actually just this week, our senior leadership is in London to discuss it with our international partners, since Artemis isn't just a US effort, it's US with our global and commercial partners. So we are working on fine-tuning our objectives. But I'm an optimist, and I think with realistic funding levels, the Artemis Base Camp could be completed within the next decade.
Okay. Peter, Vishnu, would you like to add anything? No? Okay. So my next question, Bavia, Peter also mentioned Starship. That could change things tremendously for the Artemis program. So in the current NASA timeline, Gateway is a key feature, and that's something that you inherited from the previous administration. Do you still view that as a necessary keystone for sustainable lunar exploration, especially if Starship meets the expectations that it is showing right now, if Starship becomes a feasible thing?
So first of all, I actually think it's not the best idea if every new administration that comes in throws out what the previous administration did, right? So when this administration came, we worked very hard to make sure that we don't do that, Moon Mars ping pong that happens, every time there is a change of administration. And I think for the same reason, it is not helpful to throw away the Gateway. The Gateway is One, we have international commitments. And again, as we've just discussed, our global leadership is an important part of what we do in space. And going back on promises made does not put us in the best light. So that would be one reason. Another one is the gateway also, and again, that is my personal view. The gateway also kind of provides long-term commitment to stay in cislunar space. The gateway is a fundamental component of the Artemis architecture today. Having an orbiting station at the moon provides a stable communication relay between the moon, including elements on the surface and Earth. And until we have a surface habitat, we can only land 2 crew on the lunar surface at a time. And I understand, Starship changes the equation. And I think one of the things we need to do is to keep our architectures modular and flexible. So as new capabilities come in, we can on-ramp them, right? So, and I think that is something that we are thinking about. But given until we know how that shakes out, I think having 4 astronauts go up, even if only 2 can go down to the surface, I don't know about you, but I'd rather dock Orion to the gateway and spend my time in orbit or aboard the space station, where I can spread out a bit, conducting important investigations and technology demonstrations. And again, like I said, gateway is designed to internationally agree to interoperability standards, making it possible for multiple partners to develop compatible vehicles, instruments, technology demos. It's a long-term orbiting platform with potential for a rich future in deep space scientific research. So for the moment, Gateway is part of the NASA architecture, Artemis architecture.
All right, thank you, Bavia. So you mentioned the importance of not falling back on our commitments, and each of you mentioned the importance of the Artemis Accords and U.S. global leadership in space. So my next question is for you, Peter. Are DoD programs to produce lunar infrastructure, such as the Novel Orbital and Moon Manufacturing Materials and Mass Efficient Design Program, or Nomad for short, are those programs complementary or contradictory to the Outer Space Treaty and NASA's stated purpose in the Artemis Accords to utilize the moon for peaceful purposes?
I think they're fundamentally complementary. The Outer Space Treaty is very clear about what's prohibited. You are specifically allowed anything for use of space, any equipment you need for use or exploration of space. Everything in Nomad would be use. It's all for peaceful, as we've defined, peaceful purposes. So the Outer Space Treaty specifically prohibits having fortifications on the moon or doing weapons testing on the moon, but Nomad is not doing any of that. It's a purely university-based effort to examine how you could construct large-scale photovoltaics, large-scale radio frequency, and large-scale infrared antennas or apertures from space materials. And those are all things that would aid in Earth observation and deep space, new next-generation deep space telescopes, like the James Webb, only much, much larger, hundreds of meters, and could ultimately enable things like space solar power. So it's not uncommon, for DARPA to do things like this that are strategic on many levels. And one of the things, Bavia mentioned several analogies for Artemis Base Camp, that I don't like. I think Antarctica is a terrible model. It's resulted in zero economic growth. I think the right model for Artemis Base Camp is the internet. That this is the government spending some money to create, basic infrastructure and standards that then everybody else, can make use of as it goes larger. But in order to do that, NASA has to be very intelligent about its architecture. It has to be, deliberately, setting things up to create markets, to create scale. And there certainly are places where NASA is doing that. I think NASA is doing some great things, thinking about PNT, thinking about communications. As I mentioned before, I think there are directions that you could take the surface power that would make it, really exciting. And I'd like to see, NASA step into exactly the sorts of things in a big way that they're doing in a very small way. I think I think the Lunar Surface Initiative is something around, 78 million. In my view, that's, like 2 orders of magnitude too low. I disagree with Bavia's, first of all, it was law for a particular period of time. Settlement was the law of the land for NASA. It isn't presently. But as one of the folks, mentioned, human exploration wasn't part of the original Space Act, but that didn't, stop NASA from doing the right thing. And lunar industrialization, I think, is exactly under developing, new commercial products and helping the industrial sector. I think it's just a more specific term, for it. So I think that is clearly within NASA's charter. And I think, in fact, some of the ways that NASA has thought about COTS and is trying to move towards LEO industrialization, which, LEO industrialization isn't any more in the Space Act than lunar industrialization. So, though in the last NASA administrator was very clear on industrialization, but I think it really does come down to, NASA was birthed during the Cold War to pursue national security objectives and enable us to, have a peaceful competition that improved our relative global standing. Now, at that point in time, there were certainly aspects that were, technological and industrial, but the major battle was prestige and public diplomacy. And while those elements remain important today, that is not the major problem that NASA is being asked to task. It really is setting us up for competitive industrialization of the inner solar system, which is going to determine the security of the United States through peaceful means. Now, and if NASA's not up to that challenge, if we can't count on NASA to keep up their end of the bargain, then maybe we need to think about, giving those missions, to another organization whose head is in the game.
Bavia, Vishnu, you have anything to add?
Yeah, just one thing is that, there are other DoD programs that are also complementary. I think, Peter mentioned Nomad, but you also have the CHIPS program that is being planned out of the Air Force Research Lab, looking at providing cislunar space domain awareness that also complements and supports, these 70-odd missions that are going towards the moon over the next decade, and making sure that they get there in a safe way, and everybody is behaving in a good way. So I would say the activities of the DoD. I mean, I kind of disagree a little bit with Peter in the sense that other entities might have their head in the game, but there's only one entity publicly doing the actual work, and that's NASA. So it's maybe there is capability on the DoD side to do a better job than what NASA has been doing, but the fact that NASA has been doing for 50 plus years, has to carry some weight. And I kind of tend to agree a little bit with Bavia that, science and engineering comes first. Commercialization is important, and these scientific and engineering activities enable those commercial activities, like it's happening in LEO right now, and eventually that will happen on the moon too. I think what I sense as the frustration is the timeline of it, rather than timeline and how we're going about it. Can we do it faster, better, rather than the destination itself? I think everybody wants to get there, but we're trying to figure out how best to get there. Who's better off doing it quicker or more efficiently?
So one way to make things quicker and more efficient is to use the commercial sector, which NASA has done. We mentioned CLIPS and some other programs. So Bobby, my question for you, on the topic of Base Camp and the commercial sector, NASA recently awarded contracts to Axiom and Collins to develop the XEVA spacesuits for Artemis and for the ISS. NASA plans to purchase these suits as a service from the providers instead of buying the suits outright, because NASA intends for other actors to use the suits, not just NASA. So will the Base Camp components, such as the service habitat, will those be done in the same way? Will NASA purchase those as a service, or will NASA buy the Base Camp components outright and it's NASA owned and for NASA use only? To phrase it in terms easier to understand, if I had the resources, which I don't, but if I did, could I pay for my own private mission to stay at Base Camp? Or is NASA going to say, no, we put it here and this is ours to use?
I think NASA is absolutely looking for services for many of the base camp components. A recent request for information, for example, issued to US industry about the lunar terrain vehicle, for example, asked companies to weigh in on the LTV as a service versus an element wholly procured by NASA. And again, that's just one example. We are looking at power that we could purchase. We are looking at other sort of infrastructure services. So absolutely, I mean, I think NASA sees itself as only one. So there is this innovation ecosystem on the surface of the moon, and in cislunar space, Gateway is part of it, and NASA is one element of it. Obviously, NASA must have the vision, and NASA has most of the funding, at least for the moment. But it is something we see as working with our commercial partners, our traditional and non-traditional industry partners. As I said, I spent the last 2 days at talking to startups in the Pittsburgh area and finding amazing companies with technologies that we absolutely will be using in the lunar system. And we are making rapid changes in our procurement policies. We've talked enough about CRS, HLS, CLIPS. I mean, we continue to innovate faster than almost any of the government agency with respect to working with the private sector.
All right, thank you, Bavia. So we're running shorter on time than I thought we would be at this point, and we have a lot of questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we'll go to Q&A with the audience. So this question is directed to anybody who wants to respond on the panel. China is rapidly advancing in outer space, which Peter discussed, and we've all mentioned. And it has stated ambitions to establish long-term human operations on the moon by the mid-2030s. So my question to you all is, if the United States at risk of falling behind on the moon and elsewhere in outer space, if so, what do we need to do to catch up? Or if we've not fallen behind, if that's not a risk, what do we need to do to make sure that we don't fall behind?
Well, I can go quickly, although I know this is an area Peter has thought long and hard about. So, I mean, I think it goes without saying, and I think maybe finally Peter and I are about to agree on something.
That's how I like to close things, so good.
The first country to establish regular crewed operations in deep space or another planetary body will be the dominant voice in determining a wide variety of space norms and standards. These norms and standards aren't just, for cislunar space. They will apply likely to all future deep space activity, including national defense activities and the exploration of planetary bodies beyond the moon, including Mars. And if the United States and our partners, and I just, I continue to make the case of our international partners, we go together, we are not going alone. Actually, there's a statement my boss, Pam Milroy, makes that, if you want to go far, you go alone. If you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to go far, you go together. And I think, we feel pretty strongly that we need to, stay leaders together with our partners. And again, if we don't have this leadership, we may not be in a position to lead in establishing these norms of behavior, standards of behavior in deep space that are aligned with US and democratic values. The US going back to the moon as part of the Artemis program, and together with Artemis Accords, which both Peter and Vishnu mentioned, will improve US efforts to counter China's coercive influence in cislunar space, as China is very likely wanting to recast international rules, norms, standards, and institutions.
Well, that's absolutely correct. I absolutely agree. I mean, I feel that the United States is at significant risk of falling behind, and that's why Artemis is so important. Bobby is absolutely right that the folks that are there, and particularly there early, have an ability to lead in norms. What I'll add to that is that it isn't just being first; it's being there firstest with the mostest, and that it is that it is wealth and power that often determine whether or not your norms are going to be norms of freedom or norms of autocracy and coercive influence, to use her terms. And I think China's done some very impressive things lately. I think Chang'e 5, with its sample return, its movement out to a sun-Earth, zone and coming back. Impressive. It's well thought out relay satellite that can reach into the shadowed regions, to be the first part of an ISR net, and the perception that they have established in terms of their cadence and their cost and schedule discipline are important. And it's also important to realize the words that they use, right? They talk openly about colonizing the moon, about industrializing the moon, right? Those are words that they're not afraid to use. Their program is clearly not just about exploration. It is about colonization, industrialization, long-term national power and wealth. And I think it's terribly important that we don't get behind on those things. It's great to be able to do symbolic things, but we really need enduring things, because those are the things that are going to safeguard our children and grandchildren's future. And the moon is not just an interesting, destination to, plant flags or, play out, for domestic audiences, what we want to signal about our unity. It really is the eighth continent. It really is an immensely important, port city eventually, in the inner solar system with, low vacuum and very low gravity and, tremendous amounts of minerals and waters that are just a tremendous multiplier for anything else humanity would want to do. And it's terribly important that if the future of humanity is going to be led by free peoples and is not going to be one characterized by coercion, that it's our side that doesn't get behind on the things that matter to whether or not you can be coerced. And so that, that again is like, the fundamental thing, to NASA, scale, think about scaling. That's the fundamental, question. If we can get to scale, we will get an amazing amount of science. If we can get to scale, we will get to an amazing amount of discovery and an amazing amount of firsts. But, put the money into the bank account to get the compound interest, and then we'll reap that compound interest later.
Yeah, I think, Tyler, I agree with both my colleagues here, but I think the important investment I think we need to make is still in education. I see education as a national security issue. We need to have smart people working on these challenging problems. And, that's another way to keep up with China and, not lose focus on what the ultimate objective is.
All right, so I'd like to turn to Q&A from the audience now, but first I'm gonna ask one more question. This is the question that we end every Beyond Earth webinar with. Beyond Earth, of course, we're all about establishing sustainable communities beyond Earth. So I'd like to ask you all, when do you predict we will see the first community beyond Earth established? And community defined as economically vibrant and self-governing, self-sustaining community beyond Earth. Bavia, we'll start with you.
Okay, so that was good clarification to have, because one could argue that ISS represents the first community, right? So, but let's just kind of stick with that for the moment. Let's say free space habitats like those by Blue or NanoRacks or others, they won't start to come online until 2030, which is our current plan. Maybe that there's more, non-private money they would attack, but what point would we say it's a community as defined by you? Maybe when there's private individuals living up for 6 months at a time. So maybe that's about the 2040 time frame. If you talk about surface habitats, such as, Blue Origin's Blue Moon or something like that, something creative with Starship on the surface of the moon, I would say my prediction is about the 2050 timeline. And again, if we talk about sort of Mars habitat, at least NASA plans for the moment, late 2030s at the earliest, and no one's going to stay on Mars before we figure out how to get people to stay on the moon first. And Mars is about 10 years behind the moon in terms of technology development, and probably another 10 in terms of ability to generate value that'll lead people to go stay there. So that's if moon is in 2050, and then 10 to 20 years for Mars, we're looking at 2060 to 2070. So optimistically, we're looking at 2050s on the moon, 2070s on Mars, and I'm planning to be alive at least for the first one.
All right, so you touched free space, the moon, and Mars. Great. Peter, what's your guess? Educated guess.
Yeah, I don't think I'm probably too far off from where Bavia is. I think, you can probably accelerate, when it happens with, intelligent design by maybe 15 years. If NASA were to say, no, space settlement is going to be our job, and, let's reverse engineer that, and, what things do we have to put in place? But I still think that, I can't imagine, I can imagine economically productive outpost facilities, but I can't imagine a community, by which I mean people who live there permanently and have children, being available before about, 2050. Whether or not, the moon is ever a colony itself, or whether or not the moon sort of, becomes the shipyard for building free space colonies, or Mars. I sort of think that, and Mars may be a community of settlers, but I don't think it'll be self-sufficient by 2050. So I think Bobby is probably right that, just to build up to the scale and have, things that can meaningful return, meaning children, and they're able to, procure the basics of life for themselves, on something that's at least a town scale. I would be absolutely delighted, if it happened before 2060. But, absent somebody like, a follow-on, Elon Musk that takes something like Starship and whatever smart investments we might make on the moon, like a lunar mass driver, and then says, hey, I'm rich enough that based upon those elements, I can go and start experimenting with the first free-flying settlement, or, we can put a Jamestown down on Mars. Those probably are still not going to be self-sufficient, but they would be important, thriving communities.
Vishnu?
Tyler, I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic, than Bobby and Peter. So, going by your question, I think to be self-sufficient, we're looking at in the order of about 100 years. That's where I think.
That's fair. Thank you for being honest. All right, so we're going to turn to some audience questions now. First, here we have a question from Scott, and this is for anybody. Is there the possibility of a commercially provided spaceport with power, fuel, and communication services that could be the basis for permanent human presence, I'm guessing on the moon?
Well, certainly this is where I would hope to, and it sounds, from Bobby's remarks, that NASA is sort of looking more and more that way. I think that to design for sustainability is to design for multi-stakeholder, multi-use. So, it is almost in all cases preferable that that infrastructure would be, owned and operated by a commercial service for NASA rather than NASA owning it, because that means that they're open to and aggressive about finding other, customers and folks to sell it to. That, of course, comes with risk, but I think, that's a risk that you bear for the end in mind, and if the end in mind is to create, a thriving economy, you have to have commercial actors. So, to the extent possible, and in fact, my own thoughts about sustainability are sort of backwards from the way NASA's current plan lays it out. I would prefer that astronauts don't even arrive until there's already a habitat and rovers and in situ resource utilization, plenty of things for them to do and think about once they get there. And I'd like to have seen that those have been sort of tested and shown to be working by the commercial service. So that's something else that sort of it's an obvious role for Base Camp that we haven't really seen articulate in a formal sense, which is as a real estate, developer, which is to say, hey, this is the zone that we're going to be at. We'd like to have power over here. We'd like to have landing pads over there. We'd like to have this over there. Who wants in? What partners are we going to have? This is how much we're going to buy, and this is how much we're, going to, this is how much we're going to subsidize others who are going to be part of this. So I like the idea of maximizing, commercial, principally because I think that when you really look at the end in mind, of building a competitive and sustained in its growth space economy, you've got to have commercial actors that have the freedom to sell their wares and services.
Anybody else have anything else on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on this earlier, and I agree with Peter. I mean, NASA is working on sort of innovative new procurement and acquisition approaches to engage the commercial sector. And we are supporting not just, being a customer is, it's, I mean, obviously it takes a lot, but it's easy, but you also need to do technology development. And we are kind of working at both ends, right? So we are supporting companies develop the technologies through, programs in our Space Technology Mission Directorate and other parts of NASA as well. And then obviously being a customer as well, and they're both important.
So on the topic of commercial actors, we have a question here from Jeffrey Tudor that relates. It seems that CLIPS is a key enabling threat to help commercial companies conduct lunar operations. Does it have sufficient congressional support to keep up the funding profile required?
We can always use more money, but CLIPS is actually generally very well liked by all stakeholders. It's well liked in Congress. I think we have 7 providers locked in who would be providing payloads on the surface of the moon. But I think just a note that before we declare success and move on, not a single mission has yet launched. So we really do also need to wait and watch and see how each of the missions does. The last time, during the cheaper, better, faster days, when there were 2, in succession failures on Mars, support vanished pretty quickly. So I think it behooves us all to be very deliberate when we talk about the CLIPS program. It behooves us to talk about sort of the risk reward balance, and when you so those are things that are very important to keep in mind, and we need to make sure that regardless of what some of the early outcomes are, we continue to support the program. I mean, remember SpaceX had 3 failures in a row before it succeeded, and they were NASA was critical in ensuring that that there was a contract after the 3rd failure, right? So yeah, just wanted to remind folks that support for CLIPS is important regardless of some of the initial outcomes.
So I'm going to ask one more question here from the audience, and then we'll turn things back to Steve to close us out. This is for any or all the panelists. This is from Dave Brody. What is the Lunar Killer App Gold Rush resource or breakthrough tech spinoff that would enable a permanent lunar base as a commercial enterprise zone, so the NASA and international partners could become beneficiaries instead of just godfathers and angels? So what's the Lunar Killer App going to be?
So I can go quickly if anybody else. If anybody else wants to go. Peter, Vish, feel free. Before I came to NASA, I was at an FFRDC called the Science and Technology Policy Institute, and Stippy wrote a report on sort of demand of things on the moon, and we looked at 12 potential markets, and the market, and including remote things like helium-3, right? So across the board things, and the one that we found had the most prospects was the tourism market. And again, this report is publicly available, and folks should feel free to look at it and tell them. And again, it's no longer my report. I mean, it's get back to Stippy if they disagree with things in it.
So I think the Chinese have it right. I think it's space solar power satellites. If you look at potential size of the market and relevance, energy is almost 10% of GDP. It's about 8% of GDP, and it's expected to double. By 2100, we're going to need to have something on the order of 55 terawatts thermal to power human civilization. And of that, if you want to have a carbon neutral society, like less than 11 of those terawatts can come from carbon producing sources. So you're looking for 45 terawatts thermal of energy. And and so if there was a technology that could provide 24-hour green energy to planet Earth that would scale to all global demand, that would be a huge arrow in the quiver against climate change. And while something like Starship does appear as if it would make it cost competitive with baseload electricity, if Starship can achieve $10 million a launch, it would obviously be way better to do it with 95 plus lunar materials, where you're launching with many times less the amount of energy that you need, and could launch entirely electromagnetically. And previous studies paid for by NASA suggest that you could build these things at a speed that would be relevant for climate change. So imagine something, the global GDP is around 100 billion. So we're talking about something that's on the order of a $10 billion market. You'd need to build to power all of Earth, which you probably wouldn't do, but you'd want it to be some mix. But if you were to power all Earth, that'd be some 3,000 satellites, each on the order of 8,000 metric tons. There's no other market for upmass that's even close to that. And if you had something that is 7 kilometers across in collecting aperture, and is a kilometer, half a kilometer to a kilometer across in transmitting aperture, that sort of industrial base leads you directly to being able to build space settlements, leads you to having unbelievably ginormous next generation James Webb type of telescopes. It would allow NASA to truly be a sit back beneficiary. And as I said in my last slide, when you have gigawatts of power, you can move and fry asteroids and comets coming at you. You can send interstellar probes. You can send deep space within our solar system probes. So there is no in-space manufacturing, in situ resource utilization thing that's larger and more impactful than something that can fix climate change, enable sustainable development, create millions of metric tons draw on material, and create a system that allows you to do extremely ambitious things in the solar system. So the killer app, or the stellar app, is space solar power.
Ishnu, any thoughts on the lunar gold
I
rush?
think I agree with Bavia and Peter, but one thing I think is it's in the chat. So Richard Howard posted it. Finding out how much water is there that we can access, and having that water ready for us when we arrive. There's few things that humans and rockets need, and I think that's common thing is water. So
I think that is made complicated by the fact that, if Starship truly does $100 a kilogram, the extent to which it is actually potentially cheaper to take water from Earth if transportation is that cheap. So I think it gets complicated after a while.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to turn things back to Steve. I want to thank you all for joining me. I know we didn't all agree on everything, but I think we all agreed that the United States needs to maintain its leadership in space. So I hope Congress is listening and funds accordingly. I also want to apologize to our audience members who didn't get your questions answered. We always run out of time, so we'll get you next time. Steve, back to you.
Hey, thank you, Tyler. And really, thank you, Vishnu, Bavia, Peter, for an extraordinary conversation. This conversation indicates this. It really represents the relationship between NASA, who is trying to do the best that they can with their budgetary constraints, with their policy mandates and so forth, and are moving forward in that way. And then those outside voices, which I think Bobby agrees, the outside voices are important, you know, that Peter represents, that are you know, either sometimes more forcefully and maybe sometimes less forcefully trying to push the agenda forward, trying to see if we can accelerate this development in different ways. And I think, Peter, thank you so much for being that voice, both here and in the space community in general. And Vishnu, thank you so much for getting us sort of granular on some of those very specific issues and items and technical issues that we need to be considering when we're talking about developing the resources on the moon. I want to, yeah, so, and there was so much I would love to get into. I mean, the whole discussion around space settlement is an ongoing issue, obviously, concern for the Beyond Earth Institute. We're going to be looking at that issue very much as part of what we do with Beyond Earth. So with that, before I let you go, I do want to make sure that everyone puts on their calendar and saves the date for the Beyond Earth Symposium. This will be our inaugural event for the Beyond Earth Institute. It is taking place on October 13th in Washington, D.C. It will be an in-person event. It is primarily for individuals within the space policy community, and then we will have it live streamed to just about anyone who wants to watch it virtually. So please put this on your calendar. And with that, I will thank you all and want to have a great day. And we'll talk to you again next time. Take care.